Thank you so much. It's great to be here. This is my third time in Bismarck, or the area, which wasn't initially clear to me the whole way through. The first time I came here, I was invited to Mandan, and the second time was to Bismarck, and when I got here, I thought, boy, this place looks just like Mandan. I'm a slow learner, so you'll have to bear with me, but it is great to be here. And I can tell you a little bit about myself and how I got started, and about my past, and then about our future, the future of food. So, my history with food starts with a trip I took in 1996 to visit my brother. He was living in Chile, and I just graduated from university, and he invited me down, and we spent a weekend out on the beach on the Pacific Ocean, and he bought some steak. And Chileans don't like people from Argentina, but if you want to get a good steak in Chile, you get steak from Argentina. So they must really be saying something by doing that, because they don't like Argentina, but they say, yes, they do have better steak. So he bought a whole Argentine tenderloin, and we brought it out to the beach. We built a fire, and when the coals were just perfect, we laid the grill down. The grill got hot, and we seared and cooked this tenderloin. And I took a bite of that steak, and it changed my life. It's one of those moments, it happens rarely, but you put food in your mouth, and it's like reality just slows down, and you have this kind of, oh my God moment, what is going on? It was just an unbelievably delicious piece of beef. And I asked what I thought was a pretty simple question, which was, why did this steak taste so good? And I got back home, and I started to try and do some research. The internet was just forming at the time. There wasn't a whole lot there. I think I searched on Alta Vista, if I remember. I called the USDA, and they say it's all about marbling by prime. We don't have prime in Canada, but we have something similar called AAA. That wasn't so good. It wasn't the same. I found out that the Argentines say the trick to cooking a great steak is to just use salt. So I did that, and it just sort of tasted like a kind of a greasy, salty, buttery thing. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association said the same thing. And I started digging deeper and deeper, and I realized there's a lot going on here. Steak is odd, right? It's the premier meat. When you sign a big deal, you go out for a steak dinner. You don't go for chicken. You don't go for pork. But it's strange. You go to a steakhouse, and they can give you a wine list. And this wine's from Argentina. This wine's from Spain. This wine's from France. They can tell you the grape, the year, who made it. And then you say, well, where's your steak from? And they're like, oh, it's from the cardboard box. And that's about as deep as it goes. So I traveled the world in search of the best steak, but asking deeper questions about steak. Why do we like beef? Why do we like meat? Did we evolve eating meat? Is meat healthy? And why does food taste the way it does? And what I found out about steak was that the very, very best steak, like that Argentine beef, comes from grass-fed cattle. It's not easy to do. It's both a science and an art, and the very worst steak I had was also grass-fed beef. But when it's done right, when it all comes together, it is a truly ethereal eating experience. What I also found is that most of the meat we eat is just very mediocre. We cram a lot of corn into our cattle. We get them fat the cheap way, and it's not terrible. It's not utterly unpalatable. It's just not awfully beef-like. It's kind of like mature veal. It's pretty young. It's kind of greasy, and there's not a whole lot of flavor. And I got very interested in this idea of flavor and what flavor means, because there was something odd about the steak book. I started thinking, this great steak, when I find it, it's going to be some kind of an atrocity. It will be terrible for me. I might have a heart attack. It'll be awful for the cow. Probably have to be tortured its whole life to become delicious. And it'll be just a train wreck environmentally, like 18 747s flying at the same time. And what I found is that it was actually the opposite. The best tasting steak was the best for me. It was the best for the cow. It was the best for the planet. So that started to tell me that there's something that we're not getting quite right about food and flavor. We tend to think that deliciousness is a terrible thing. Well, that led to my second book called The Dorito Effect. And for this book, I just start to look at our food system through the lens of flavor. We are all nutritionists. We talk about carbs. We talk about fat. We get into arguments around the dinner table. We think we understand food on a molecular basis. And we think this whole idea of flavor just sort of gets in the way. Well, the Dorito Effect, I looked at food and what's happened to food from the point of view of flavor, and there's two simultaneous trends. All the food that we grow on farms, the livestock as well as the green things, the plants, are getting blander. It's because we've achieved enormous gains in quantity, but it's come at the expense of quality. So we know this most profoundly when we bite into a tomato or a strawberry, and it's just never really lives up to that expectation of deliciousness that we hold so dearly. At the same time, the flavor compounds that are disappearing from the foods that we grow, we're putting into processed foods. We have flavor factories, chemical factories that produce flavors, and food processors put them on the food that we eat. So the The best example would be something like a dorito, which is just a corn tortilla that we have imbued with the flavor. The first one was taco flavored that turned it into a bestseller. And we can make food taste like whatever we want it to taste like. So the story is that real food's getting blander, and we're making processed food ever more irresistible. So my message that I want to share to you today about the future of food is that taste isn't everything. Taste is the only thing. And I want to get you guys to think about this by asking a question that I don't want anyone to answer because it's an awkward question. But has anyone here ever been on a diet? Don't answer. But I will tell you this. The US weight loss market is worth about $100 billion a year. So that's $300 per person for every baby, toddler, child, grown man, woman, elderly person, $300 per person per year, every year. That's how much money we're spending on trying to not eat. Even if you haven't dieted, we all experience the fear and the guilt of food. If you go out for something like an ice cream cone, there's this kind of sting that you're indulging in something you shouldn't be doing. There's this sense of calories. You're eating something you shouldn't be eating. Even things like eggs that we know are, we used to think were so bad for us, the source of cholesterol. Even though that's now gone, we still wince when we crack an egg because this was just so put into us. And we know we have a problem with food, and we know that it's in our nature. We have no control over what we eat. And the experts, everybody tells us it's because of how we are. Does anybody recognize this guy? Anyone know who he is? Jack LaLanne. He was one of America's first nutrition and fitness gurus, and he really keyed on early that food is a problem. He had a message to people. He said, if it tastes good, spit it out. And he was onto something. He lived to the ripe old age of 96 years old. So he knew something. So I want to show you this guy is my great uncle John. He was born not far from here in Lethbridge, Alberta. He was Ukrainian, a lot of Ukes up in Alberta. He spent his life eating things like cabbage rolls and pierogies, and he lived to be 105 years old. But just think how long he would have lived if he'd spat out his food. And the scientists tell us this as well. You may have heard of the thrifty gene hypothesis. And the idea is that when we were evolving, food was unpredictable. Famine could sweep in at any moment. And if any of us had the ability just to carry a little bit of energy, just to have a little bit of padding of extra energy, that when famine struck, these people were protected from starvation. And over time, this got baked into our genetic code, such that now we find ourselves today with this genetic inheritance of wanting to conserve and carry energy around, only we live in a very different food environment. And it is essentially, it is our fate. We are cursed. When we think of eating, we're like vacuum cleaners. We're constantly on. We're constantly drawing food into ourselves, only now this is what we're vacuuming up. So this is the predicament we find ourselves in. There's one recent author who said that food is more addictive than drugs like heroin and cocaine. Scientists say that our food environment is hyper-palatable. It is too delicious. Food is so tasty, we can't stop eating it. And everything I told you isn't true just now. I agree that we're definitely eating too much food, but what I want to tell you is not because it's too delicious. And there's a good evolutionary reason for this. They talk about the thrifty gene hypothesis. There's a lot that gets wrong. And just think for a moment about what it's like to carry around too much weight. Some people are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds overweight. Walk around with a backpack and put that kind of a weight in it. Walk up the stairs, walk around the block, go to work. It's hard work, and if there's one thing that nature abhors, it's inefficiency, and it is inefficient to carry that much weight. It's something we don't see in nature. If you think of us as animals that had to survive in a natural milieu, when you're carrying a great deal of extra weight, you cannot accelerate as efficiently, you cannot decelerate as efficiently, you certainly can't turn as efficiently. If you're a predator, you're going to have a much more difficult time catching prey, and if you're prey, you're a lot easier to catch, and you're much more delectable. Some of the best evidence is when we look at athletes. The highest performing human athletes are incredibly trim. So when we function at our best, it's when we are trim, and we had to function well in an evolutionary milieu in order to survive. Scientists talk about another hypothesis called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And this is a trade-off that took place about 300 million years ago. our ancient ancestors had very small brains and very big guts. We were a bit more like cows. We had to eat all day, and we ate very fibrous food, and it took a long time to digest, so we spent lots and lots of time eating. As we evolved, our brains got bigger, our guts got smaller. That was very important because that gave us the luxury of time. It meant we could spend less time eating. Monkeys spend about 80% of their waking hours eating. We spend far less. There's an important lesson there because that meant as we started to eat more high-calorie food, nuts, fruit, fatty meat, that didn't make us more addicted to food. It didn't make us more engaged with food. In some sense, it made us less engaged because it gave us this ability to say, I'm going to stop eating now, and I'm going to make tools, I'm going to build a permanent structure. So there's something about this very high-quality diet that we evolved to eat, which entails not being permanently engaged with food. So that's the scientific argument, but I think there's an even better argument, which is this place, Italy. If you think this food environment that we live in is delicious, I implore you to take a trip to Italy. Italy is the most delicious food environment in the Western world. No one cares more about the way food tastes than Italians. Italy is the home of the slow food movement. They have unbelievable rules about food in Italy. You've probably heard about some of the rules they have about wine in Europe. So, you can only call champagne champagne. If you make a sparkling wine a certain way in a region called Champagne, it's champagne. If you cross the road and do the same thing, you can't call it champagne. We think these things are silly, but there's a reason they have these rules because they are obsessed with food being its most tasty. So they have these rules for wine, but in Italy they also have them for food. It's called DOP, and it stands for Protected Designation of Origin. Now think about that last word. It's origin. They know that food tastes a certain way when it comes from a certain place. It's a rudimentary understanding of the importance not only of soil, but of the people who farm that soil, who've grown for centuries on that land and best understand how to best use that land to create food. Some examples of DOP foods, have you heard of San Marzano tomatoes? So this is a canned tomato. It comes from the San Marzano region of Italy, and it's a certain type of tomato. You can only call it a San Marzano tomato if it's a certain kind of tomato grown there. Another example is what we call Parmesan cheese, they call Parmigiano. You can only make it in a certain part of Italy. The cattle cannot eat any grain, it has to be hay or grass, and that's the rule. You could make a very similar cheese, you can't call it that. These are laws that they have. The same with mozzarella. This is a scene from a food festival. It's called a sagra. A sagra is just a big public party to eat food. They have them for the Italian foods you would expect, like the cheeses they have, the mushrooms they have, but they also have sagras for things like frog's legs, for donkey, for tripe, for dried cod. And they don't dress it up in anything noble about the land, about nutrition. It is just a flat-out party. Let's get together and eat. They have 27,000 sagras in Italy every year. Italy is the 6th most visited country in the world. And surveys show that visitors come to Italy for one overriding reason. It's to eat food and to drink. So if we're going to talk about delicious food environments, we're going to talk about a food environment as being hyper-palatable. Who's hyper-palatable? It's Italy. So if that's true, and all the stuff I told you earlier about food is true, then we have to ask a question. Shouldn't Italy be the fattest country in the world? They're eating the most delicious food. Shouldn't they be eating lots and lots of that food? So let's look at some statistics. This is the obesity in the United States. That's one measure we have of tracking our relationship with food. In 1980, we can see it really started to accelerate around 1975. So 15% in 1980 to 23.2, 31, 36. We're at 42%. This is what it looks like for Italy. In 1980, it was 9%. In 1990, it was 9%, and it continues. It's holding. It's something that is inexplicable. I researched this. I talked to experts in this, and they're on some level not even aware. When I mention this, they're surprised. They say, well, Italy's just 20 years behind us because they think this is destiny, that no one could possibly escape the trap of food. Well, it's not true because when we started taking statistics on this in the early 1960s, we were already at 13%, and Italy's at 9% and holding. There's something different going on in Italy. So what's going on? Well, some people say it's because Italians eat a traditional diet. That's also not true. The Italian diet has changed since 1950 just as much as our own, in a different way, but the statistics are shocking. Since 1950, Italian men have doubled the amount of meat that they eat. They have more than doubled the amount of cheese that they eat. But it's Italian women that will blow your mind. They have tripled their meat intake since the 1950s. They have quadrupled the amount of dessert that they eat, and they have quintupled the amount of cheese that they eat. And you think, well, how could this be possible? How could they do that and things are still holding steady at 9%? It's because they're not eating as much as some of the other things. They eat less olive oil than they used to. They drink far less wine than they used to, and they don't eat as much grain. So they're still eating a lot of pasta, but not as much as they ate in the 1950s. So what is the real difference between Italians and us when it comes to food? And the answer is their view and our view of nature. Our own human nature and also nature itself. And when we think about nature, we think there's something wrong with it. We think that food is flawed, that we have to fix it, that we have to pump it full of vitamins, or that we have to do things like eat artificial sweeteners because things that are naturally sweet are bad for us. And we think there's something wrong with us, that we have absolutely no ability to control what we eat, and that our appetite must be rigorously controlled. So we have to change and control the food, and we have to control ourselves because we essentially think of ourselves as garbage cans, unfillable garbage cans. Italians don't look that way at all. They don't think of food primarily on a nutritional basis. They argue about food all the time. But all the arguments that I witnessed about food in Italy were about how you make it, where is the best this, who has the best recipe for this. They are passionate about quality. They don't eat microwave pizza in Italy because they don't think it tastes any good. They are obsessed about things like the crust of the pizza that they make, and they get into arguments about which region has the best tradition. These are just some pictures I took while in Italy, and it is the best place in the Western world that you can eat. This is called tortellini. This is a stuffed little dumpling. They stuff it with Parmesan cheese, mortadella, which is the kind of progenitor of bologna, and pork. And they have rules about how you make tortellini. They even have a brotherhood of tortellini. These are people who on some level worship it. They wear golden colored robes, and the leader wears a medallion, and they have meetings. They talk about who has the best tortellini. They give out awards, and they have rules. And they say it must be served in a broth, and the broth must be made from beef and a farmyard chicken. Not just any chicken, a farmyard chicken. These people are serious about food. And you can go to Italy, and you can buy tortellini, and it's wonderful. And somehow they eat this wonderful food, and they have a passionate, engaged, amazing relationship with food and the land that food comes from. And they have a very healthy relationship. That's how we're supposed to live. Food should not only sustain you, it should be one of the greatest sources of pleasure in your life. So my message to you is that, number one, you're not a garbage can. Number two, food tastes the way it does for a very important reason, reasons we're only now beginning to understand. If you think of your genome as the instruction manual to make you, the thickest chapter is on your food sensing apparatus, your mouth and your nose. That's the thickest chapter. If you think about the brain and your brain lighting up as it does stuff, the most engaging thing the brain can do is taste food. That lights up more gray matter than doing algebra, than having sex, than laughing. So the act of tasting food from an evolutionary and a physiological point of view is clearly really, really important. So when we think about our food problem, we tend to think about it again in this idea of controlling, that we can control it, that we can do things to change our own behavior and to change food. This is a nice one I saw recently, that the boss from Beyond Meat thinks that we should tax actual meat so he can sell more of his not actual meat. But there's something interesting in this assumption that we have that we're just going to one day figure it out and legislate our way out of it. We assume on one hand that it is going to be a simple explanation, and we assume also that whichever scientist figures this out is going to be the person who writes the legislation, but it's not going to work that way, because don't forget who writes legislation. So if we're going to think about how to get out of this food mess, this difficulty we have, let's think less about controlling food, changing laws, and think more about ourselves, be more like Italians, and care about eating real food that comes from real places that tastes really good. So that is my message for you today, is think about flavor, and think about all that goes into that. And our next speaker, Dan, is going to tell us more about the incredible complexity of the foods that we eat that we take for granted. So, thank you.